to begin?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll start.
She's been great. She's so helpful.
Attention, everyone.
She just sent me something.
Hello, all. Welcome to this wonderful panel on the work of Bradley Walker Tomlin. My name is Sarah Casti, and I'm the director of the Samuel Dorsky Museum of Art here on campus. And I hope all of you have had a chance to see the show that we're going to be talking about. But if not, once we finish this panel, I invite you to go over and take a look at the exhibition in the museum. It's open until 5. So anyway, thank you all for coming and for giving our panelists a wonderful audience to work with. I have the privilege now of introducing our moderator, a wonderful colleague, Janice LaMotta, who is the executive director and curator of the permanent collection at the Woodstock Arts Association and Museum.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for the invitation to be here to do this. And if you haven't seen the show, I urge you to visit it. I don't know if the gallery is open after this panel discussion will end, till 5, so that might actually be a nice time to visit it. Anyway, I'd like to introduce our panel to you. Just turn this down. Starting at the far end, we have Svetlana Alpers, who is an art historian, critic, and occasional artist, as well as Professor Emerita of the Department of History of Art at the University of California, Berkeley, and visiting scholar, Department of Art History at New York University. Her books include The Art of Describing, Rembrandt's Enterprise, Tiepolo and the Pictorial Intelligence, The Vexations of Art, and most recently, Roof Life, an Anti-Memoir. Alpers is currently writing a book about Walter Evans, and she lives in New York and Paris. Next to Svetlana is Tom Wolfe. Tom is professor of art history at Bard College, specializing in 20th century art. He is curator and author of Konrad Kramer, a retrospective, Yasuo Kuniyoshi, painter-photographer, Woodstock's art heritage, give me the best pronunciation. Yasuo Kuniyoshi's Woman, Birdcliff, an American arts and crafts colony, Carl Eric Linden, From Sweden to Woodstock, The Maverick Art Colony, Peggy Bacon, Katz and Caricatures, and the artistic journey of Yasuo Kuniyoshi for the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This was the retrospective of Kuniyoshi's work that took place in 2015. And next to me is Daniel Belasco, who is the curator of exhibitions and programs at the Samuel Dorsky Museum. And he has been with the museum from 2013 to August of 2016. Daniel has just taken the position of executive director of the Al Held Foundation. So this is a beautiful swan song, the Bradley Walker Tomlin exhibition. While at the Dorsky, Daniel curated numerous exhibitions, including Bradley Walker Tomlin, a retrospective, Grace Hartigan, Myths and Malls, Dick Pollock, Transforming Metal into Art, and Mary Reed Kelly, Working Objects and Videos, which won the AICA USA Prize for Best Time-Based Format, second place. From 2007 to 2012, Belasco was Henry J. Lear Associate Curator of the Jewish Museum, curating Shifting the Gaze, Painting and Feminism, among other exhibitions. And in September 2016, as I just mentioned, he'll assume the new position as executive director of the Al Held Foundation. So please welcome our panelists. The format today is that each person will give thanks so much, we'll give a brief presentation, and then I'll pose a few questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up for a question and answer. So I'd like to start with Daniel Belasco.
Okay. Thank you, Janice. I'm going to have to turn my side to you as I talk, just because we've had technical difficulties that were unresolvable, so this is the best workaround. I'm going to get my arm here and move the slides forward and try not to, and we'll work through it. So this exhibition was an intersection of my own longstanding personal interest in abstract expressionism, and specifically exploring the lesser known stories and figures, some of the hidden sort of private content in abstract expressionist painting, which is so highly personal, so highly subjective, yet in its time of making, in the 1940s and 50s, only certain stories were really considered acceptable for public consumption, and a lot of other stories, especially women's stories, but also African Americans, gays and lesbians, others who were not straight white men, were not able to fully articulate their own subjectivities publicly about abstract, while they were making abstract expressionist work. So that was sort of my larger project, and then at the Dorsky Museum, having this special mission exploring the art and culture of the Hudson Valley and a long-standing relationship to the Woodstock art colony, learning that Tomlin had spent many summers in Woodstock from about 1925 to pretty much the end of his life in 1953, made him a legitimate subject for this museum to explore. I was startled to learn that there had not been a retrospective or comprehensive showing of Tomlin's work in 40 years. 1975, the Albright Knox had a traveling exhibition, which produced the last major publication about Tomlin. And there was a small show at Brooke College in 1989 of his paintings, and that was it. So Dorsky took this opportunity to introduce to not just one, but really two generations of art goers who Tomlin was and what he accomplished in his short truncated career, which culminated in 5 years of his life as an abstract expressionist. And for those who know Tomlin, it's because of this, partially because of this photo, because of his abstract expressionist work. He is all the way on the side, not surprisingly, next to two people he corresponded with closely, Robert Motherwell to Tomlin's right, and then Rothko right below him. So Tomlin is all the way at the far right of this picture. And this is the famous Nina Lean photo of the Irascibles that was published in Life magazine and includes most of the major protagonists of abstract expressionism, showing them their defiance and also this sense of loose collectivity. These are some also shots of articles about Tomlin and photos of him in Art News, also towards the end of his life when he really had this peak. Here he is again with Motherwell and Rothko, showing their paintings, which were purchased by John D. Rockefeller III. And I think two of them, or maybe all of them, are now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And another slide from Art News, which appeared the month before Tomlin died, about his second Betty Parsons exhibition. Here's Tomlin in his studio, surrounded by his paintings. So if Tomlin is known and famous, it's for this work. It's for this community that he was a part of. 5 years before the Nina Lean photograph was taken, Tomlin was with a very different group of artists. Here he is in the Frank Wren Gallery, which was a significant gallery showing artists like Edward Hopper, Charles Birchfield, John Carroll, Eugene Spiker, the subject of a recent Dorsky exhibition, artists who were, for the most part, 15 or 20 years older than Tomlin. He was a junior member of this group, whereas he was among the older members of the abstract expressionist group. So I was amazed that in 5 years, he changed communities, he changed styles, he changed impulses, and certainly an exhibition could focus on that 5-year period and what came after, but I felt like I needed a more runway to get to that point, to get to that transition, so it justified a presentation of his entire career. Okay, so another group photo. Tomlin was born in 1899 in Syracuse, New York, and he was a hometown boy. He went to Syracuse University, which had the first degree-granting program in art in the United States. It was called Krause College. So this photo is from 1919. He is in the low, and he's seated on the lower level. I guess we call the front row, third from the left. And you'll note that there's there are more women in this photo than men, and I don't know all the reasons why, but part of it is because of World War I. Tomlin went to college in 1917, where at the same time when the United States entered World War I, so a lot of college-age men were enlisted in the Army. But Tomlin, because of various ailments, did not go into the Army in World War I, and he was even just old enough to be considered for service during World War II, and also was given a status of 4F. But I think he was stimulated by the engagements of the United States within world affairs and world conflict, but also very interested in exploring, his own personal engagement with art, design, architecture, antiques. There was a whole host of elements that stimulated him. So show a couple of very early images. His professors at the time had I think an important and stimulating influence on him. This was an impressionistic painting that Tomlin made. He also made commercial work, illustrations for children's books, and this is the frontispiece for a children's book that was published in 1921. And you can see both the publication and this original drawing in the museum exhibition. Also, these linear Art Nouveau-esque line drawings. Figuration was ultimately not something that he explored much beyond the 1920s, but he got an early start there. He moved to New York in 1922, shortly after graduating from Syracuse, and he won a major prize at the college, and he then won a Tiffany Foundation grant. So he was a very well recognized young artist, and he had a very strong network as a young man of potential patrons and supporters, that he was able to carry forward from Syracuse to New York, and through a classmate, he was from Syracuse, gained an introduction to Condé Nast, the magazine publisher of most famously Vogue, but also House and Garden and Vanity Fair. And so he had this 24 covers for Condé Nast magazines, mostly for House and Garden, through the 1920s. So Tomlin had this bifurcated career as a commercial illustrator and also we call a fine arts easel painter, and also created decorative works on commission. So he was very much a working artist, and I think he had a specific vision of where he wanted to go and how he wanted to paint, but he was also assimilating so many different directives from his patrons that it took him quite a while. But he had his own individual subject matter that he continued to return to. Certain animals like cats and horses. He liked very complex framing. He rarely presented a subject without an intricate system of framing. So here this cat is framed by the tree, which then is offset by the federal built house in the background. So, and the style is, the perspective is somewhat skewed. And you can see the original drawing and also how it was published on House and Garden. This is from circa 1930. This is an example of his decorative painting, a commissioned work for a private residence in Manhattan. Also, it's not fully flat in the same way that you might think of a Georgia O'Keeffe painting of the similar time, with a close-up focus of a calla lily. But he's interested in modeling and three-dimensionality and sort of an added texture. His work is not purely optical and purely abstract. And also just the perimeter of this work is full of incident and different patterns, and there's the ionic column on the lower right and the checkerboard and the leaf. And so I think he created a lot of problems and challenges for himself as an artist that other artists may have chosen to elided or evaded, but for Tomlin, he was interested in seeing how much he could bring into a canvas. Simplicity was not a particular goal of his, and even the colors that he chose, he was that the colors that he mixed were very unusual shades of green and yellow and all sorts of whites and greens and blues, things that we just hadn't, I personally really hadn't seen before, that Tomlin effortlessly seemed to include in his artwork throughout his career. So I was also trying to trace this larger context of Tomlin as, not just as a painter. Actually, I should add, one point about the previous work is a sense of context and who Tomlin was in conversation with. And some of his closest friends and associates in the 1920s were artists like him who were painters, fine arts painters, but also people who had careers in some field of the decorative arts. Artists like Frank London, James Brooks, who later became an abstract expressionist, Julian Mansfield, who was a classmate at Syracuse, Sylvia Pedler, Gwen Davies, who both lived in Woodstock. These were the artists that he seemed to be most comfortable communicating with in the 1920s, artists who were as interested in fashion and textiles and interior decoration as Picasso and Matisse. Okay, so Tomlin also in 1932, with the Depression, needed to find other income. The art market largely dried up, and he began teaching at Sarah Lawrence College, and he taught there from 1932 to 1941. He was a painter, an instructor of painting and drawing, and he presumably had many students. There weren't that many that I could find documentation of. Most of them were because of an exhibition that he engineered at Montross Gallery, which was an important gallery for American artists of Sarah Lawrence College students in the 1930s. So he was supportive of his students. And I show images that relate to two of them, Marion Apple, who eventually moved to Woodstock. She was Sarah Lawrence class of 1934. She became a WPA muralist. She designed the Village Green in Woodstock, the War Memorial. She credits Tomlin to being an important, teacher and inspiration for her. This is a painting that's in the Smithsonian, and it's not that reminiscent of Tomlin, except for I think the color, the trees, the pinks, that kind of close attention to unusual tonalist variations is something that I think Tomlin could have passed along to her. So this is Tomlin shifted gears significantly again and was inspired by Cubism, Surrealism. This is a work that's now in the collection of Sarah Lawrence College and was gifted to them by Mary Griggs Burke, who was another one of Tomlin's students. She was the class of 1938. She was not an artist. She became a patron and a collector of Japanese art, but also Chinese and Korean art. And there's now a major exhibition, permanent exhibition, at the Met Museum from the Mary Griggs Burke collection. They accepted 300 Japanese and Korean works, and Burke largely credits Tomlin as the one who introduced her to Japanese art, but also to how to understand a picture. And I'll read a quote that she wrote before she died. She said, quote, "Tomlin taught me how to look at and really understand a picture. He rejected stereotypes and could grasp the meaning of all true artists." So if you go to the Met and you go to the Asian wing, and go to the Mary Griggs Burke collection, you'll be standing in some part of, what I think of the legacy of Bradley Walker Tomlin. He became interested in the work by a younger generation of artists, such as Adolf Gottlieb, artist Mark Rothko, artists who became the core group of the abstract expressionists. He was very close to an artist named Frank London, who died in 1945, and Tomlin was seeking new connections, new inspirations, new people to talk about with art. And he had been in an exhibition with Adolf Gottlieb, the Federation of Modern Painters and Sculptors show in 1941, and it made a deep impression on Tomlin. And so Tomlin wrote Gottlieb a letter in 1945 saying that he was he wished to have some of the simplicity of Gottlieb, and this is an example of the type of work that Gottlieb showed in that exhibition. So whereas this Tomlin was fascinating and crowded with incident and all of these alternatives, some of which he ended up building on and others he left behind, I think Gottlieb pointed a way to hone in on the elements that Tomlin wanted to focus in. And within a year roughly of that encounter with Gottlieb in 45, by 46, Tomlin is painting in a non-objective manner. Certainly the influences of Gorky and Picasso are there. So this was what's called period style. For Tomlin, he was transitioning into a new personal style. Yet I think at the same time it did establish a certain set of parameters that were, if not uniquely Tomlin, specific to Tomlin, and definitely this relationship between the grid and the gesture. Not every abstract expressionist painter was interested in that. It seems reductive, but they didn't all work this way, but Tomlin did. And Richard Diebenkorn from San Francisco got a grant in 1946 to travel to New York, and he sought out Tomlin as one of the artists he really wanted to learn from. And a year or so after an encounter with Tomlin, Diebenkorn was making work which is, I think, reminiscent of interplanetary greetings. So I'm not creating specific causality that only Tomlin was helping Diebenkorn resolve his style, but still I think it's important to at least include Tomlin in this type of conversation, whereas he's been excluded for so long. In 1948, Jackson Pollock had his breakthrough all over drip paintings. Tomlin was totally fascinated by Pollock, tried to get close to Pollock, but Pollock didn't like being close to many artists at all, and Tomlin would pester him with questions about why his paint wasn't mixing and bleeding together on the canvas. Tomlin was such a craftsman. And Herbert Ferber said that Tomlin was the only one who really knew how to mix paint, and so Tomlin really wanted to know more about Pollock's technique, but of course Pollock wouldn't give him the time of day. But they were friendly, but Pollock didn't like talking shop. Lou Krasner, though, was more, I think, affected by her conversations with Tomlin. Tomlin visited them in the Springs and East Hampton. Pollock had the big room, the studio, and Krasner was working upstairs in a small bedroom, making what she called the little image paintings. And she has said in multiple interviews subsequently that Tomlin was one of the few artists who really encouraged her, take her seriously, and give her that impetus to continue in the direction that she was moving in. And around this time, Tomlin made his most minimal, reductive paintings. This one is called Tension by Moonlight, also 1948. He takes several gestural brushstrokes and lays them with ample room for them to take on a life of their own. And this is one of a number of works that he made at this time. And in my mind, he really was not that interested in what Pollock was ultimately doing. Tomlin did not make all-over paintings. He was, to me, closer to Barnett Newman or Clifford Still or Mark Rothko, trying to kind of really boil down painting to the essentials. They had different ideas of what the essentials of painting were, and Tomlin, as this consummate craftsperson, the essential is always the brushstroke and the pigment, and mixing the paint and finding these incredible colors and color combinations. But there was some confusion about influences at this time, and whereas it was supposed to be a one-way idea of influence that Gottlieb was influencing Tomlin, at the same time Tomlin was certainly in Gottlieb's studio and providing a certain amount of conversation, discourse. and apparently, according to Gottlieb, titled this painting Sounds at Night. But in subsequent literature, when a critic said that Tomlin was influencing Gottlieb, Clement Greenberg and other critics were outraged. It was inconceivable that, that Tomlin could possibly be, sharing ideas with other artists, that Tomlin was only receiving ideas. Okay, so this is an example of Bart Newman's work, also 1948, which I think is in a way comparable to what Tomlin was doing. But Newman stayed here, whereas Tomlin moved on. This is number 9, In Praise of Gertrude Stein. It's in the collection of MoMA, and Tomlin invented this calligraphic style. We use that term pretty loosely about a lot of the abstract and post-abstract expressionist artists, but if you really look at, who was there first and who really distilled the brushstroke and the gesture into a sense of calligraphy that's resonant of, of Asian calligraphy and of Islamic calligraphy and of the Western brushstroke, Tomlin really was one of the few people who worked that out. So another piece of Tomlin's legacy is his relationship with Robert Motherwell, his support of Robert Motherwell. They shared a studio in late 48, 49. Motherwell painted at night, Tomlin painted during the day, so they were ships passing. Motherwell was apparently depressed at some point, quasi-suicidal, was about to destroy the contents of his studio, which included works like Granada, which is up on the screen, or The Voyage, which is in the collection of MoMA. These are works on paper. Tomlin encouraged him to keep them, to mount them on masonite, and to preserve them, and now they're in significant collections. This one is in the Rockefeller family collection. And these became foundational works for Motherwell. His Elegies to the Spanish Republic became his signature subject, which he returned to over many, many years, and Tomlin helped preserve the earliest iterations from this series. And Franz Klein, a friend of Tomlin's, among others, possibly also was looking at Tomlin and got this idea of distilling the brushstroke into the subject of painting. This is Cardinal from 1950. And another, I'm going very long, aren't I? Another, I'll try to get through this more quickly, sorry. Another possible impact, influence, Judson Smith, a close friend of his from Woodstock, was painting in a realist manner circa 1940. That painting's in the Dorsky collection, and then made these abstractions around 1950. This is one of Tomlin's last great paintings, indicating the future. And this, we were talking earlier about this idea of the serif, and Tomlin added these serifs to his brushstroke. So even when he might have been exploring a minimalist approach to painting, there was always these little extra flourishes, this little desire to add more. He was close to Gustin. This was dedicated to Gustin. By Gustin, dedicated to Tomlin. And so I'm going to show slides of a couple of lesser-known painters who were looking at Tomlin and claimed that they were directly interested in his work, and not that these are great, important works or necessarily significant artists, but just that helps understand how people were seeing Tomlin, in his lifetime, and what he was valued for, and where things could have gone, both for Tomlin and for other artists, had he lived past 1953. So Audrey Flack, who became known as a photorealist painter, started as an abstract expressionist and took these Tomlin short, wide brushstrokes in an Oliver painting, which she called Abstract for Tomlin. It's very dark. Rosemary Beck, who was a Woodstock painter, also found something that she can build on with Tomlin's brushstrokes. Calvert Coggeshall, a lesser-known abstract expressionist painter, also adopted Tomlin's brushstrokes. In fact, he named his son Tomlin, and they had some family. I was in touch with Tomlin Coggeshall, and I was desperate to see if they had any paintings or letters or anything like that, but they don't have anything like that. And one last work by a more contemporary painter, Louise Fishman, and this idea of control and design and gesture and brushstroke is part of that legacy of Tomlin that is picked up by subsequent painters like Louise Fishman and I think many others. And so when I think about what Tomlin has given us, it's not just his career, but all these possibilities for how artists can work and how painters can paint subsequently to his career. So thank you.
Okay. I'm going to talk a bit about Tomlin and Woodstock because that's kind of the focus of much of my research. Woodstock, New York, which is an artist colony with a long history, which I found very rewarding to study because it's kind of a microcosm involving hundreds of artists, but also many who have been forgotten, but all of whom had close relationships with other artists in New York or going back and forth from Woodstock and New York, like Tomlin. So I'm going to give a little overview of some issues that come up with his life and work there, and some background to the context of his work there. He went there periodically a lot for the summers, starting in the 20s through the end of his life. He had multiple dwellings there at various times. He was usually struggling to make a living, but Svetlana asked me why he went there. One reason was for Frank London, who was a close friend of his and a painter also. One of these painters who's quite interesting, but almost totally forgotten. This is a photograph of Frank London, and he was one of Tomlin's closest relationships. This is the one. There's a Frank London portrait of Tomlin, location unknown. This is, I think, a beautiful and kind of pensive portrait of Tomlin by Frank London that's in the exhibition here. Also reproduced in the catalog, which is gorgeous, I think. I mean, I didn't do it, so I can give it homage. It's really a beautiful catalog.
And in the collection of the Woodstock Artists Association.
Yeah, and the collection of the Woodstock Artists Association, which several of the works that Daniel showed as well are. So when Tomlin started in painting in Woodstock in the 20s, there's a note he wrote where he kind of pinpointed the most successful and important, the best artists of the time, and also he said the two most successful in the Woodstock context were Eugene Spiker, who's an example of whose work is here, and Henry Lee McPhee. McPhee started, he worked for a while in a kind of modernist style. This is from the early 20s. This is quite daring for Woodstock art and also American art in the 20s. But then he kind of got into a more conservative style, monumental still lifes, very carefully composed with somewhat evocative subject matter. And this is the kind of painting that I think both London and Tomlin were responding to in the 20s. This is a Frank London painting in the collection of the Woodstock Artists Association Museum. I think you can see the connection, kind of an evocative grouping of objects that are set up as a still life that the painter then renders with great fidelity. This is a Tomlin I found going through files at the Woodstock Artists Association that I reproduced in the catalog. It's a location unknown. This is a reproduction in the New York Times, which defines it as having been shown at the Woodstock Artists Association in 1926. The Woodstock Artists Association was established by Woodstock artists in the middle of town, still there. Janice is the director, to show their art to the local community and to their fellow artists. And so it's still going on. It was a venue for the various currents of modernism and conservatism that were prevalent at the same time in this town. So this is, I think, again, related to McPhee. This is a Tomlin painting from the same period that's in the show here that will give you a sense of the color. So he's doing sensitive and I think sometimes evocative still life paintings and portraits in the 20s. This is jumping ahead. And this is a painting called Burial, and this is from 1942. He didn't go into the Army. I think he was too old, but also he had some physical ailments that kept him out of the Army in the First World War and again in the Second World War, but he's one of the artists who responded to the war by turning what by now is a kind of Cubist-derived style into something evoking some of the tragedies of that conflict through the title, and then I think once you explore the imagery, that resonates as well, the idea of burial and a kind of gravestone imagery, and that appears in some of his works from the period also. This is a documentary photograph also from 1943 when there were events in Woodstock to support the Allied forces during the combat of World War II. And this is a booth in honor of France, Vive la France, that he did with a fellow artist named Antoinette Schulte. He's standing to the right in a typically kind of introverted pose, kind of drawn into himself and also quite dapper. And that's typical of his persona. This is one of the houses he lived in while in Woodstock. I was able to find a couple of them. First, he lived in a rooming house. Sometimes his mother would come and live with him for some time. And always in company of Frank London. And in New York, for a while, he lived in London's house with his wife and 2 children and London. And he also traveled in Europe and painted with London. And this is a house that he bought when he by surprise got some money from a philanthropist who passed away and left money to a group of artists he admired. So he bought this elegant house. This is a recent photograph. It's still there. And had a beautiful studio and spent a lot of time and energy in decorating it, too much. So then he ran out of money and then he had to abandon it again. It's on Ohio Mountain Road. And he bought it from the artist Judson Smith, who Daniel showed you a couple of paintings by. This is an early work by Judson Smith, who is a pretty conservative realist. This looks like the hills of Woodstock, maybe even on Ohio Mountain Road. Judson Smith was in Woodstock pretty early on, and he bought a bunch of property from a farmer on Ohio Mountain Road who wouldn't sell him part of it. He insisted on selling it all to him. And then subsequently, he would sell parcels to various artists, including Tomlin at this time. So Judson Smith, I think, is kind of typical of a lot of the tendencies in Woodstock art in this period. Very close to Tomlin. There's a lot of correspondence between them. He was 20 years older than Tomlin, starting in a kind of traditional realist style, painting everyday life and the environment around him, and evolving into something like this. From 1950, I think you can see how close it is to Tomlin. Not as complicated or as energized as Tomlin. And this is another Judson Smith from around 1950 to 1952. And this is a Tomlin from 1946. I kind of focused on this painting a bit because he showed it at the Woodstock Artists Association, which was a forum in this period for ambitious artists to debut their new work. And it was called Interplanetary Greeting. What does that title mean? My surmise, or my guess, my interpretation is that in the context of the art that was going on at the time, Eugene Spiker had this painting in the same show. It was like coming from another world. So he called it Interplanetary Greeting because there was a lot of controversy between the artists moving towards abstract expressionism and those who were very successful. Spiker was extremely successful financially and reputation-wise, but rooted in traditional art a lot more than the younger abstract expressionists who were breaking away. Daniel showed you this. This is the Raine artist, and it's in the show, this photograph. Also 1946, before Tomlin left Raine's more conservative stable for Betty Parsons. But this is Spiker, and that's Tomlin. I could imagine they're kind of glaring at each other across the room, but I don't think that's the case. But in any case, there they are in the same space. Philip Guston, like Daniel said, was a close friend of Guston's, a fellow painter who spent a lot of time in Woodstock from the 30s on. He periodically would come there. And he also, in this period, was debuting major artistic efforts of his by showing them first at the Woodstock Artists Association, including this, The Porch from 1947, which is still rooted in World War II kind of tortured figuration, unlike that Tomlin, which that Interplanetary Greeting, where he's really stepping into abstraction. And this is a couple years later, The Tormentors, one of Guston's first major abstract paintings that he also showed at the Woodstock Artists Association Museum. This is, again, the house on Ohio Mountain Road, and one of Tomlin's neighbors on Ohio Mountain Road was a sculptor who was very prominent between the wars named Carl Walters, and this is kind of a plug in a way, or a preview, because I'm curating an exhibition of Carl Walters for the Dorsky Museum that's going to be here in February, so I've been kind of immersed in him. But one of his most striking pieces that people respond to a lot is this, which he called the death of art. He's a ceramic artist, and he did these little, very inventively, he did these little tableaus, like little stage sets, which he populated with glazed clay figures. This seems to be a kind of lustmord, a kind of sexual act of sexual violence and murder, and it's called the death of art, so we most people assume it's motivated by that painting hanging above this couple, which looks a lot like a Jackson Pollock all-over drip painting, which Daniel mentioned already. Walters was older. He was almost 20 years older than Tomlin, and he was established in Woodstock on the Maverick Colony with a house also on Ohio Mountain Road where Tomlin's house was for 2 years. He was established as a ceramic artist and a maker of functional ceramic objects. So this is a Jackson Pollock painting from 1947. Willem de Kooning famously said Jackson broke the ice, by which he meant that Pollock was the first to plunge into totally abstract all-over painting in 1947. The Walters group is 1946, so Pollock was working towards it and it was in the air, but if you had to pin it on somebody, I would guess that Walters was responding to some of these Tomlins that were shown at his local art gallery and painted by someone as part of his Woodstock community. I've had some further thoughts about this. This is another Carl Walters. He did a lot of circus scenes. This is from 1948. It's a small cabinet piece. It's a three-dimensional object, so what Walters would often do would also paint the back of it. And to me, this is kind of taking a leap, but this kind of relates to some of Tomlin's work. And I think Walters wouldn't think of this as a painting. I think he was offended by large-scale abstract paintings, but in a sense, I think that Tomlin would maybe respond to this. Tomlin loved the decorative arts. There's a lot of beautiful calligraphy and drawing with a brush in his work. So I think there's a kind of resonance here. This is a Tomlin that's in the show. And this is the side on the left of that Walters cabinet, and this is another Tomlin painting in the show. I think Walters was probably upset with this kind of work being presented as fine art, but I think Tomlin might have responded to what Walters was doing here, and I think a lot of other issues are raised here that are still relevant in the art world today, the relationship between craft and fine art, the interplay between them, the kind of hierarchy there, and also in terms of Tomlin, I think one of the most important things about the catalog that we have here, and thanks to Daniel's research, is the first time it's really been established that Tomlin was gay. It's been said a couple of times in passing remarks by a few critics, but Daniel found evidence, and we talk about his secondary status as an abstract expressionist or his marginalization. That's got partially to do with the fact that he died young, and the other abstract expressionists lived longer, partially to do that he was the second oldest of the abstract expressionists. Only Hans Hofmann was older than he, but it also had something to do with the fact that he was gay in a very macho company, and his paintings are considered more decorative than those of the rest of most of the rest of the abstract expressionists who were striving for an art that was tragic and timeless, to quote them, quote Gottlieb and Rothko and Newman in this famous statement they wrote. So he's doing something that's elegant and decorative, and they're trying to do something that's tragic and timeless. So I think there's a kind of affinity here that maybe Carl Walters overlooked. So that concludes my little remarks about Tomlin. Thank you for hearing me out.
It's a marvelous exhibit, Daniel, and I love Tomlin back to childhood, where an artist friend of my parents had a Tomlin. We haven't been able to find it. We found another painting that Herbert Ferber and Ilse owned, but not the one that I remember, which was a vertical, but it was a vertical and did exist. And I remember, or think I remember, how does one know about those things, loving it when I was a child. What am I talking? 8, 9, 10, something like that. Probably till a little older, because I lived one college year in the Ferber 454 Riverside penthouse. And so that painting was there, and I love it, and I've talked about it publicly on occasions. My real interest in it, my subject is usually old master painting. I'm a painting person, and I think Tomlin is just a great painter. I mean, in his great last style. I don't think that about it's an extraordinary rupture in his work, really. And I don't think we can talk about a development. I think he's biding his time. And I would say that it's very hard for artists to do that these days. They don't have the time to do that. They're not given the time. Now, maybe it was too long for him. He's born in 1899. He comes into his own in his 40s. And he had many successful careers. He had many careers on his way. He was not an unsuccessful artist. He wasn't just hanging around. He was unhappy, maybe, by nature. I want to say a few things first by introduction and then get into those things. I think the fact that he's not highly valued and the fact that there is not a body of critical literature about him makes his work indeed independent and fresh. You walk into that gallery and you just see it freshly. There's not money signs and there's not a lot of words. And that, I think, is an advantage in looking at it. It's a great advantage for me. That's one of the reasons. I just think it's a wonderful, he's wonderful, and just thank you for putting the show together. It's just a marvelous show. Now, I did not look at it thinking of him as an underappreciated artist, nor did I look at it thinking, an unacknowledged gay. That was not in my mind when I looked at the show. My mind was a great late style. What is going on there? That's what interests me about it. And less the other two factors, that he's unacknowledged as a gay or that he's underappreciated. Those are minor compared to the real interest of the art, it seems to me. Now, as I said, he had not one career but careers, and he was actually a successful artist. He was selling. Duncan Phillips bought one in the 40s. The Phillips collection has 3, and the first one Duncan Phillips he bought in the 40s while he was still with the Raine Gallery. So people of note and high taste were buying his painting, even before the rupture, and he really found himself, we might say, in his art. Now, and as I said, that long period is very unusual. Alex Katz once said to me, he calls me Svetlana. Svetlana, he said, it takes 10 years at least to become an artist. And Alex did it by making picture frames or something. And now artists get out of an MA program at Yale, Columbia, and they're on the market. And there's simply no time to grow up, in my view, as an artist. I think it's a really deep problem for the art we look at. Maybe that's one of the reasons I'm working on photography, frankly, because I'm just churning, because I really prefer painting, but Walker Evans is pretty good, so he's the closest I can come to a great artist in photography. Okay, now, I think there are certain consistencies in the work that you see as you look. Burial is a sort of wonderful example of that, I think, in the pre-rupture work, right? He scratches into the paint with some point, some kind of an object point he scratches. He makes those wonderful, and you see it in the left in Burial, those wonderful geometric planes of paint, right? And then there's a wonderful portrait of after a photograph of his mother, where he's just playing with paint. Her whole collar is the most wonderful display of a painter just loving to work with his paint. And you see that bursting out through the ribbons and the squares and the dots in that last great painting that we have in the show from Vassar, 52, 53, number 4. The numbers are complicated because you keep renumbering every year, so 4, there are many 4s. This is 4, 1952, 53. Okay, now, something happened, and we're not going to go into all of that, but it happened quite suddenly. And what happens, I think, is he finds his graphic mark, and it happens to be a mark in white. And you see that in that wonderful painting, the black one, with the title of Tension by Moonlight, right. And that is where he finds his mark. And there's no point trying to figure where he got there. It is a sudden rupture. He suddenly finds himself and feels comfortable when he gets to that mark. At least that's my looking at it. And the point is, it's white. And at that same point, he finds an ordered aspect to the spontaneity that he's producing. So those two things come at once. The order. Now the characteristic mark, which you see in that late painting, the last one, as you run around before you get to the photographs in the exhibit. And I said to Daniel, I thought it was smart of him to put all the photographs at the end. So you don't walk in and start looking at photographs of the artist. You are faced with the art, with the problem of the art. And at the end, you can check that out. But you have to first look at the art. At least that's how it's laid out in the exhibition. And there you see, he takes a squared edge brush. And in fact, I think Motherwell, or one of them, said to him at one point, is recorded, said, well, why don't you use a brush which is rounded? And he said he didn't answer, he just didn't do it. And that square edge brush, very, very light, in light paint, it's not heavy, it's thin paint, is dragged. And sometimes he releases the pressure so you get a break in that ribbon. And that is the basic thing he does, to which he adds squares and circles. White is extremely important to his work. And I think it's important to add here, apropos, I understand that historians can be interested in influence, and you said very smartly to me, well, what other artists think about a painter, Daniel said to me when we were driving somewhere yesterday, that is partly helps you understand the painter. Well, look, I worked on G.B. Tiepolo. There's nobody who learned from Tiepolo. And in fact, Velázquez in Spain, he stops painting and they're all looking like Rubens. It's true Manet came along. It's not true that all really great painters have a whole bunch of people who are really interested. This might be something we think of in the 21st or 20th century. But with Tiepolo, I cared about what he did. With Velázquez, I care about he did. I really don't care, although I did write about Manet and Velázquez. I really care about how we can look at, attend to what they did. And this late great style, we hope somebody will follow up on this show and put together a show of all of his late great, we both agree, his late great paintings. We just need that show. It would be what, 25, 30 works, something like that. Perfectly doable. And notably and sadly, MoMA and the Phillips did not lend to this show. And they should get their paintings out there and we should be able to look at them. All right, now, just to conclude, it's interesting that music has come in to some of the best criticism on it. The syncopation and rhythm of his painting, I think, leads people to think music. Henry McBride, a super critic, well, he wasn't always super, but he could be marvelous. He wrote about the about to be 53 Betty Parsons show, Walker Tomlin's last show, and he compared him to Bach. And then I was introduced to this piece by Dave Hickey in Our Century, compared him to Miles Davis. Interesting. The Bach comparison has to do with a motif which is played with. The Davis comparison, taking a very different line, which is Hickey's line, has to do with with something that looks spontaneous, but in fact is not. What he's saying that Davis does with jazz is not to just play around, but to fake it. It's artifice. It's not like jazz, it's post-jazz. And he's saying that is what these ribbons are, these strokes are in Tomlin. In other words, it is an artifice. It is not freedom. It is structure. It's art. And I think that's, when you look at them, you can see it's a very helpful thing. Bach has to do with the kind of order we feel. This has to do with the kind of artifice that is it. And then I just want to finish by quoting the other thing I haven't said about him, but it's been hinted by both of the people who've talked before. This was not an optimistic, happy man, not a man who believed in the sublime, who believed in great achievement. He was modest, he was constrained, and not joyous, and very, very smart. And in fact, I want to just end with a word of what I think the thing to call it would be Tomlin's doubt. I'm playing around with something I don't love the article about which Merleau-Ponty talked about Cézanne's doubt. This guy spent a lot of time in Europe, and we should all say that European art, he's painting out of that tradition. He's not an American firster. Barney Newman once said, I think, who cares about all that art of the past? That was not Tomlin's view at all. He was very aware of past art, even past pre-American art. Right? It wasn't a stance he wanted to take, and some American painters, Barney Newman certainly took that. And so his doubt really means that there is a kind of angst, a kind of uncertainty. And he said this wonderful thing. I won't give you the reason he was brought to it, but I think you see it in the fragility of the relationship between the marks he makes. Even though there's order, and that last painting that we have in the exhibit, the Vassar College loan, which Daniel says looks better here than it does in the rather more crowded circumstances of the Vassar Museum, is just perfect of this, because we've seen the ordering and then new disruptions are coming in, smudges, breaks in the ribbons. Okay, so he said, this is now Tomlin, the simple truth about the matter of links, he once wrote, is if they are good at all, they break. And that's Tomlin. Okay.
Svetlana, you're one of the first art historians that I've heard who really speaks like a painter.
Oh, that's such a nice thing for you, a painter, to say. Wow, thank you.
Let me just get this. You can hear me? I wanted to first start in talking about the exhibition itself before going to Tomlin more specifically. In Irving Sandler's foreword in the catalog that accompanied Tomlin's retrospective in 1976, he states, "This survey of Bradley Walker Tomlin's painting comes at an opportune moment when growing numbers of young artists are again venturing into painterly abstraction." So that was in 1976. And what I wanted to pose to the panel, and probably first to you, Daniel, is in revisiting Tomlin's work 40 years after the fact, what did you really want to accomplish with the exhibition? What did you want to say in terms of revisiting Tomlin and his work and his relationship to his work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I found that Sandler remark to be this cautionary tale that you think you're doing something great by bringing an artist out, and then all of a sudden everything will fall into place, and that this artist will be restored to the firmament of people's consciousness. The goal, I think, was maybe pegged to Tomlin himself as just to present his entire arc of his career, knowing that the abstract expressionist paintings are seen, not commonly, but the MoMA did bring some of them out in their big collection show in 2011, and the Phillips will show their Tomlins from time to time, and the Whitney will show their Tomlins from time to time, and the Munson Proctor. And so with the great paintings and the great collections are seen, and those who love Tomlin will seek him out and find him, find the works. But what was missing was a sense of, who he was as a person, and also the entire arc of his career. So the show is not a huge show, but it's a comprehensive exhibition, and the idea of painting as a craft is not a thesis that I put forth in the show or in the catalog, but it's an idea that I've had where, in a way, it's the last craft standing, where everything else, so much there's a great almost fetishization of cooking and woodworking and knife making, and everything is craft and artisanal and handmade, but somehow painting seems to resist this conversation. It's still highly conceptual, highly intellectual, and thinking about Tomlin as a craftsperson, as someone who's process-oriented, someone who's oriented to tradition. There's an inherent humility that he had with his materials and his own sense of himself within the world as a human being, but also within his contemporaries as painters. That's something as comfortable people talking about in the realm of craft, but not so much in the realm of painting, and certainly not abstract expressionist painting, which is, so often overblown. So that was some of my personal, ideas about how the show could potentially resonate, but where it goes and who may, but hopefully it will lead to an exhibition like Svetlana indicated, that the big, great paintings of the last 5 or 6 years of his life have to be surveyed somewhere, hopefully in the next 10 years.
Or maybe, Svetlana, I'm thinking your comment relative to younger artists not getting the chance to really develop, and Sandler's comment about
Not taking, let's say not only giving, not taking it. I'm sorry, it's
Yeah.
partly their responsibility.
Yeah.
Come on.
Agreed.
They want to make some money, or and they think if they don't make it when they're 25, forget it. And that might be true, but, there are too many of them, in my view, anyhow. I mean, no, seriously, they should do something else. They shouldn't all
many
be
art
trying to get to Coggeshall or whatever it is. This is not fair. There are some awfully good artists out there. So I apologize.
So
but
what
it's
do you
irritating.
think would be the response of contemporary artists, those enrolled in master's programs, let's say, who would see this exhibition? Understanding,
Yeah, but look, did I say it or not? I meant to end, but I might have forgotten. For me, and I said this to Daniel apropos of his concern about what artists really paid attention to him. And I was fascinated with your showing the people, and that was really fascinating to see some of those people up there who did seem, taking from him, modest folk, but nevertheless who thought, wow, in some way. For me, the telling thing is that he was bought by, and I'm forgetting his name right now, Robert Ryman has one, right? Now, Robert Ryman is a white painter, right? And he sees this, and he owns a Tomlin. He bought a Tomlin recently. And that to me is it. That's enough. We don't need, I'm sort of kidding you, Daniel, we don't need all these people being influenced. A Robert Ryman buys a Tomlin, and Ryman does not have a huge collection, but that's an eye, and that's a sense of what art is doing, and that for me is, almost makes it. That's almost enough. But I'm a critic, and I'm an old master critic, and you're in the game of showing art. And you're teaching art like this, so I'm sort of aside from all you people who are more involved hands-on than I am.
I think if I could just
yeah.
a comment about this idea of Tomlin emerged from the gates, very successful, at 22
Yes.
years old. So, age 22, 23, Condé Nast was a patron. He was showing his work in art museums. He received prestigious fellowships. So he was recognized as a very young man. Perhaps he was overexposed and maybe was pigeonholed in a certain way, and he struggled out of that position. It may have taken him 25 years to do that. So that might be a model for, art students today. And he did have professional academic training in a university setting, and he did have mentors, and all the systems were in place that Tomlin experienced in the teens and early 20s that a lot of art students experience now. So I think he might be relevant by that measure.
Tom, you want to weigh in at all?
Yeah, okay. It's a lot has been said, and I think Dave Hickey said it in his article about Tomlin. There's a lot of abstract painting around today. A lot of the artists you're talking about are doing attractive abstract paintings.
Right.
So, and I think Hickey suggested even the decorative side of Tomlin is part of what is his legacy today, for better or for worse. I also think the young artists who are shooting to success, it's a very dangerous path, because the worst thing I've seen from artist colleagues is to have an early success and then just have it evaporate, and then you're facing the rest of your life to be bitter. So not always great.
I wanted to talk a little bit, or have you guys talk a little bit more about Tomlin's relationship with the other artists of the New York School. He died at 53. In 53, a lot of the others went on to live into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What do you think? Let's talk a little bit about his relationship with some of the other artists, and also was there something prophetic he left behind in his work that they would have responded to? I mean,
Well, I was always interested in the fact that he did not really have a relationship with de Kooning. And de Kooning is the only other, I think, a major abstract expressionist painter who had an excellent academic art training. And so there's very little discussion about any relationship between Tomlin and de Kooning. And if you put their works side by side, they seem somewhat antithetical in how they painted, but their use of color, I think, is quite similar in its deep complexity. And but Tomlin didn't need to talk to de Kooning in a way because I think they both knew the same thing. They were different personalities, whereas Tomlin did talk much more closely to Rothko, Motherwell, Gottlieb, because they had something that Tomlin needed, which he himself called the simplicity.
Well, he was also close to Raoul Haig, who was a sculptor based in Woodstock, part of that generation, along with David Smith. So they were very close. And also Gustin. I mean, Gustin is a key figure here, going back and forth to Woodstock, but also being together in New York. James Brooks, who's also not as much a household word anymore as Pollock or de Kooning or Newman. He was part of the milieu as well. And in terms of the other dialogue we're talking about, I've been watching a little bit this artist Joe Bradley, who's out of nowhere showing a Gagosian. Looks a lot like James Brooks to me, and maybe some Tomlin in there too. Okay. So there is this resurgence now on, maybe it's just the marketplace, they're attractive large-scale paintings, but there is this resurgence now of painterly abstraction that's quite prevalent in the New York art scene as we speak.
But would you call him painterly abstraction? I wouldn't.
Joe Bradley?
No, Tomlin.
Oh.
Doesn't seem to me it's painterly. It's kind of anti-painterly, right? It's that very dry brush which has very little paint on it, which is dragged. I mean, he's retreating from that. I mean, we have to be precise about what we mean. Obviously, I gather he liked to talk shop. I mean, that's what annoyed Pollock. Pollock really didn't want to do it. But it mattered to him, and I think that you can perhaps remember who said that. He liked to talk to people. Obviously, he didn't want to talk about himself. He was a very private man, right? And the others, I mean, Motherwell was married 3 times, Ferber was married 3 times. And, when people talk about his life, he was in the household of London for 20 years. That was his relationship. It's a little bit like James Schuyler and Fairfield Porter. Schuyler lived with Porter and his wife. I mean, this is one thing that how gay lives played out then. Are we to say it was a disaster, it was wrong, they should have been public? No, this is how they lived. And he lived that way. So for 20 years, he had a stable relationship, as far as we can gather, right? And these other guys didn't. I mean, he was much more stable than they were in his what we consider in America, it's just not a regular life. Well, it was a regular life. And curiously, it's only after the 1945 death of London that he really makes the break. It's absolutely fascinating. He's despairing, London drops dead, his art takes off. It's absolutely fascinating. So in his misery and his bereavement, but anyhow, he obviously was kept apart in a certain way, wouldn't you say, from the abstract expressionists? I mean, I might remember him seeing at Ferber's apartment, if it's not my fantasy, and he did go, but this is a quiet, distant man, a big group of, the rest of them sat around and sort of talked and argued. I mean, it was a big, particularly if it's polite to say, so the Jewish element, it's that New York, we see it in the Partisan Review, it's that New York argumentative group, and they were close to the Partisan. Ferber was close to the Partisan. William Phillips was a friend. Phillips was in these groups. So people were arguing. Clearly, that's the last thing Tomlin would have wanted to do.
But he liked being around it.
He liked to have it going on, but he was on the edge, I would say. He was an on-the-edge man, in a way.
Yeah, there was some memoir of him sitting alone in the Cedar Bar when everybody was talking. And in terms of painterly, it's a question of defining our terms.
Okay.
But I was looking at the show. I mean, we would need to be in front of the painting for this. where these colors just melt into each other.
Yeah, I don't like that painting, but all right.
Well, still and all.
Okay.
Control and spontaneity, which I think is one of Daniel's main interpretive
Right.
terms and to deal with Tomlin and myself also, the drips. I mean, he's drawing with a brush and it's dry, but it's also dripping and puddling.
Yeah, the
into-
drip, it's funny, I had the painting I really love, which is MoMA out, they have it stored out in Queens, and they never bring it out. It's a vertical one, it was Betty Parsons, it was shown to Betty Parsons. The drips I find hard. I mean, if you go up, and it's interesting the distance you can take from these paintings. You can stand back from them, but when you go up close, you see an awful lot that's happening that you don't see. So if you go into the gallery, walk up. And the drips, I don't, and there's even that painting we noticed where he obviously painted it in the other direction and then turned it, so the drips go horizontal. You can see that they're dripping horizontal because he was painting a horizontal painting and then he decided, hey, it's gonna look better vertical. But the drips I find, I mean, that's something about painting I find, and I know painters, Melissa, who came up with me, she paints on the floor to avoid drips. I mean, if you're not careful, it drips, right? And then and if you look at the last painting, you can see where he's wiped some out, where he decided, I don't like the look of that drip.
Yeah.
But that's a curious thing, but
Well, that's also making the process part of the
that's
visual
absolutely,
statement, yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
And this one has got drips going both ways, so.
Yes. Oh, does it really? Ah, okay. Okay, okay.
What's the black and white one I noticed?
Tension by moonlight.
Yeah, I mean, he's actually gone back into one section of the gesture, it looks like, to,
That's such a
Connected
daring, such a
a
daring
little bit.
painting, that painting.
yeah.
Which one are you
The
talking
tension
about?
by moonlight, the white on
That's
black.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was very measured, and I think he always had in mind the outcome, like where this work was ultimately going to be displayed, what its context might be. I think he just had so much experience working for various patrons.
That's a good point. That's a
that
good
we
point.
always had this idea of there being some patron, some context, whether it was commercial or otherwise out there. He did have the opportunity to contribute to, in what predated the WPA program that was run through the Treasury Department, but he was considered too modern at that time, which was 1936, I think. So we don't have a lot of works extant by Tomlin from that period. He destroyed a lot of his works from the 30s. There's some collages that are in collections. Some of the paintings have remained, but the reason why Tom is showing you these reproductions from newspapers is because the work, is largely destroyed.
Yeah.
But I think this relationship that he had to the public and a patron is
But of
critical.
course, he was collected by the creme de la creme of patrons, and when you think of what they were like compared to the ones we have around these days, I mean, these were Phillips and Blanchett Rockefeller who got the Vassar painting. These people had taste, and you said you were up at Pocantico Hills, and there's a Tomlin hanging up above the staircase. I mean, these were people of high taste. In 2 generations from being robber barons, they were actually discriminating about art. It's extraordinary. And he was bought by those people, so shall we say he thought of himself in private houses. I mean, certainly the Phillips, he was bought by people of great taste who had money, and they weren't all that expensive, and bought them and hung them. So he probably thought of himself as hanging in somebody's nice house.
Right. I think he almost, instead of having followers, he had great patrons.
That's
and
right. Well
He
put.
was he was in the collection of the Whitney and the Metropolitan before de Kooning even had a solo exhibition at a gallery. So he was part of the, he was an American modernist.
Yeah, and that woman who worked with Peggy Guggenheim, whatever her name is, right, Forrest, Juliana Forrest, recommended one to be bought by the Met, right? So he also showed at the studio school, and when I was the studio school, at that museum, at the old Whitney on 8th Street, right?
So it's almost, you had mentioned earlier something about, we have this brief 5-year period roughly where he's doing his work, his signature work really, his breakthrough work, and where we're still trying to reintroduce Tomlin to an audience, but here we're also talking about this great patronage that he had of significant patrons who were recognizing his work for what it was in the time. People like
Right.
Phillips were collecting and buying out of studios, when the
Right.
works were being made. It wasn't years later after there was criticism, and writing about the work.
And he was in the Dorothy Miller 1958-59 circulating American art show. Some people say, it's sort of State Department, CAA, selling
yeah.
American art to Europe. But he was in that show. So right in those years, he was right up.
It was right there. Yeah.
Isn't that true? I mean, wouldn't you say? Yeah.
Yeah, no, he definitely was. He was, so sort of, think about rankings. I mean, he was a top, really a top 5 abstract expressionist at the time of his death, and it's just been, unfortunately for his reputation. A lot of it also has to deal with legacy
Yes.
in terms of family.
Yep.
He had no children. He had siblings who supported his work and continued his estate, selling through Betty Parsons up until through the 70s, maybe into the 80s when she died. But at that point, also, the trail really has run cold. There's no collector, there's
So no one
family.
championing the work, really.
I mean, look at Rothko. He has a son who spends he was a psychologist or whatever. He spends his whole time collecting his father's writings, writing books about what he thinks about his father. I mean, there's an industry.
Going to
And he has
court.
nothing. He has nothing.
So in
Well,
terms of go back to what your earlier question, what I hope to also come out of this is that more material about Tomlin will just somehow reappear. Troves of letters or papers or drawings that might be in the collection of a great niece who
Right.
doesn't realize that anyone cares, but yes, people do
Right.
care and they want to know.
That really leads, go ahead, Tom.
It's also a short career, which leads to a limited output that flourished in the last part of his career. That's also abstract. I mean, Egon Schiele had a short career, but his work is like super sexual, and people are just, and also he was more prolific than Tomlin because he was doing drawings most of the time, drawings on paper. So he had hundreds and hundreds of drawings from his mature style. With Tomlin, they were mostly in major collections already. So I actually think it's one of the roles of museums like the Dorsky to bring these works to the public and to document them in catalogs. And I wouldn't be so optimistic about a show of his late works going to some
We're not
major museum.
optimistic. We're
yeah.
hoping.
Yeah.
I did have one final question, which we've sort of begun to answer, but as I looked through the exhibition and I looked at the last few paintings, I wanted more. So my question was, what's next? Or what would you hope for to be next?
Yeah, I
Which
think
we've
we-
started to answer, but,
Right.
we can
You just
revisit.
commented on
one-
it, right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think having a major show of his great works, there are bigger ones, excellent ones in other collections
Yeah.
that could be, and then buttressed by additional primary source information
Yeah.
about
It might be a
Tomlin.
problem the Phillips, the Whitney, MoMA, what the art market loves is the possibility of things being sold and handed around.
exactly.
And probably, as you're suggesting, there isn't that much
Yeah.
that you can do that with him. So the art market isn't interested.
Right.
I mean, he's not an interesting person to show. It's not going to circulate and go up.
They can't make
Unlike
money off of it,
Rothko.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's just a very small inventory, there's not a lot. When works do go to auction, they're prized and they're bought for,
Right.
but there's so few, and because they were collected, his best works
That's
are
it.
in museum
They're
collections
already in museum, right.
Yeah.
Though a couple in the show are owned by art dealers, if any of you out there are
That's
interested.
You can own one.
Right.
And want to
I
gift it to
that
the
one.
Dorsky. Or the Woodstock Artists Association Museum. I want to thank the panel. I want to congratulate Daniel on a beautiful exhibition and for bringing a conversation to Tomlin to light again after 40 years. I want to congratulate Tom on your essay in the catalog. Svetlana has a review of the exhibition, which will appear in Art Forum in we don't know.
December, something like that.
Keep buying your issues of Art Forum. And again, if you haven't seen the
No,
exhibition.
don't buy it, just go look at it somewhere. I mean, I subscribe to it, but I find it one of the hardest things to get
What is it,
through, so-
$20 an issue now, or what?
And they'll publish me, I mean, I have been editors there, that's why I do it. I don't know quite where else to go, that's why I go there. If there were really a great art news, as there was in 1950, boy, woman, run for that.
Right, right. Again, I encourage you all to see the exhibition if you haven't already, and if you have, see it again, and many more times. Thanks again for the invitation to be here, and thank you to this wonderful panel.